Hi, welcome back. Welcome to the third episode of the Be Explorer series. Now we're going to talk about space exploration. With me here, I've got Yuval Brodsky, who is from the Space Agency, the European Space Agency. So, Yuval, tell me a bit more about space exploration history. How did it all start?
So it all began with a space race between the Soviet Union and the United States in the 50s and 60s. And the first major achievement for either of the two countries was in 1957. October 4, the Soviets launched Sputnik 1. That's the first man-made satellite, to be launched and orbit the Earth. And this was a major event because from anywhere you were around the world, when Sputnik was overhead, you could see the dot moving across the sky, and you could hear it transmitted a radio signal. And if you were tuned to the right frequency, you can hear that constant beep, 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 and you knew that the Soviets were in space. And this really scared the Americans, actually, and it was a major blow to them because they were also working to put the first satellite in orbit. So from there, the Americans put a satellite into orbit, but the next major milestone was the first man in space. And we know that to be also an achievement of the Soviet Union with Yuri Gagarin, and he first went into space on April 12, 1961. And so that was the second major victory for the Soviet Union over the United States in the space race. Alan Shepard followed for the United States shortly after, just in May 1961. And so that was America sort of getting on the map. And what happened afterwards is that President Kennedy started to wonder, okay, where can America beat the Soviets in the space race? What's a milestone we can beat the Soviets to? And so he commissioned his Vice President Lyndon Johnson to do a little bit of homework and find out, okay, what's an achievable target in which the United States can beat the Soviet Union? And after a few weeks of doing some research, Lyndon Johnson came back to Kennedy and said, listen, the moon. I think we can land a person on the moon before the Soviets can do that. And so Kennedy took that and he made a famous address in 1961 and then subsequently 1962. And he said that, the United States will go to the moon by the end of this decade, being the 60s, and return him safely to Earth. Yeah. And so that set off a whole slew of events in motion. The 60s were a very, very busy period of time in NASA. Development of Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs, culminating obviously in the Apollo landings on the moon. And that was the first one being in 1969 with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin.
Yeah, and the famous quote.
That's one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind. Those are the words of Neil Armstrong as he landed on the moon.
Yeah, everybody remembers that. I mean, I wasn't there, I was too young, unfortunately, but it's well known. Everybody knows.
It's very well known.
And so, could you tell me a bit more about this Apollo mission? Like, what happened?
Yeah, so the Apollo missions are actually very complicated, and it took, like I say, there were two precursor series. I'd say there was the Mercury series, and those were in the early 60s, and then Gemini, which were two-person missions, and then Apollo, which were three-person missions. And so a lot of new capabilities had to be developed in the 1960s because NASA hadn't done this type of thing before. The trajectory planning to go to the moon is very complicated. To make sure you actually get to the moon, get around it, land on it, come back, is very complicated to do. On top of that, because of the architecture of Apollo, so you had these different vehicles that needed to work together. So there's a command module, a service module, a lunar landing module, and so once the rocket was in space in Earth orbit, it would do a burn and then go towards the moon. And so from there, the modules would separate, spin around, reconnect, go to the moon. Then the lunar lander would separate, land on the moon, leaving an orbiter around the moon. And then they would take off from the moon surface, Neil and Buzz, for example, in Apollo 11, and rendezvous with Mike Collins, who was in the module that's orbiting the moon. And then they would all come back to Earth after having separated from the lunar module. So this is a very complicated ballet in space, and they're moving very quickly, actually. The fastest they moved during the Apollo mission was almost 11 kilometers per second.
11 kilometers per second?
Yeah, it's very fast. Now they're not doing this mating thing during 11 kilometers per second, but still, it's not trivial to actually get these spacecraft to connect into a line to connect without causing them any damage, of course.
Yeah.
So it was a very complex mission, and the design of the rockets to get to the moon, the Saturn V rocket, was also really a major accomplishment. And so they were quite complicated missions, developing the technology to do spacewalks, to walk around on the moon, and later on to use a vehicle to drive around on the moon. These are all this happened in the 60s, less than a decade to develop all this technology. So it was a very busy time at NASA. It was a very impressive accomplishment.
So when was the last time we landed on the moon? The last time we went there? When was it?
So there were 6 missions that actually landed on the moon from the Apollo series, and the last one was Apollo 17. That's the last one to have landed on the moon. Yeah, and they left the moon on December 14th, 1972, so quite a while ago.
41 years ago, or something like that.
Quite some time, yeah.
And why don't we go to the moon anymore? Are we bored about the moon or something?
That's a tricky question. So there were 3 other Apollo missions that were planned, Apollo 18, 19, and 20, and they were cancelled actually, because largely it was budgetary reasons, but towards the end of the Apollo program, the American public started to get disinterested in the moon landings. And
really?
Yeah, the astronauts, in their memoirs, they'll often tell that, the viewership went down dramatically, and the public was completely disinterested. And they think it's a result of the fact that the public thought spaceflight was becoming a routine thing. Now we know that going to the moon and launching rockets and things like that doesn't exactly become routine ever, but this was the perception of the American public. So it was losing popularity, it was costing a lot of money, and the primary goal of beating the Soviet Union to the moon had already been achieved. And so there became a lot of pressure on the politicians to scale back the amount of funding that the program was getting. Funding had to be committed to Skylab and then to the space shuttle and to the International Space Station later on. So the funding needed to be reallocated. And so this is largely why. And since then we haven't been back because it's a very expensive endeavor. So no government has been willing to commit the money to do it yet by themselves. And so we haven't been back yet. But commercial spaceflight might lead us there in the near future. Who knows?
Yep. If we can afford it.
Yeah.
It's still quite expensive. And so tell me, Yuval, so we haven't been to the moon for 41 years. So my question is what do we do now in space? What the astronauts are doing up there?
So the astronauts right now are living in the International Space Station, and that's
there's no more war now. They're all living together.
Yeah, they're all living together. It's between 200 and 400 kilometers from Earth, so it's actually quite close compared to the moon. And this is a collaboration between 5 space agencies. So you have NASA, European Space Agency, Roscosmos, the Russian Space Agency, JAXA is a Japanese space agency, and the Canadian Space Agency. And so you have astronauts from all over the world that are up there living together. 6 astronauts at a time will be up there. And that's more or less the activities of astronauts in space right now, since the shuttle has been retired. The space station is really the only destination. The Chinese had recent launches as well to their own space station. But right now, human spaceflight is more or less stuck in this low Earth orbit. So quite close to Earth, really. At the moment, we're not going to Mars or to the moon or to near-Earth asteroids or anything like that.
Just going to a station.
Yeah, going to a station. And there's a lot of great research being done on the space station.
Well, what are they doing there?
It's not trivial. I mean, there's a lot of microgravity research being done. There's a lot of scientific research being done, biological experiments in physics, and many different topics. So it is a fantastic research platform. But as a destination itself, it's not another astronomical body anyway.
Okay. So talking about new exploration, and you said that we're not going to go to Mars. I mean, in a potential future, do you think that realistically we will be able to go there and walk on Mars?
Absolutely. I don't think that's the technological challenges are something we can definitely solve. At the beginning of the 60s, it was nigh impossible to go to the moon.
Yeah.
And with the dedication, the commitment, and the funding, it was made a reality. And I think the same is true for Mars. We do have some technical hurdles in front of us, but those are surmountable. They're, I think, very manageable, providing that there's the political will and the funding to do it.
Yeah.
Or not necessarily the political will. The will can come from, if it's not government institutions leading the charge, then just the will. And the motivation needs to be there.
Yeah.
And then the funding needs to follow.
Okay.
So I think it's only a matter of time. I think it's inevitable that we will step on Mars. It's just a matter of time, how long it takes between now and then.
Yeah. Well, we haven't seen any man walking on the moon, so maybe we'll see a man walking on Mars.
Hopefully.
It'll be cool, huh?
It'd be fantastic.
So just for our reader, let's talk a bit about you. Just like briefly tell us what's your job at the European Space Agency?
I'm working on integrated applications, and so mainly what I do is we use the satellites that the European Space Agency currently has in orbit and other satellites and devise systems that help us solve our problems here on Earth, whether that's in the field of healthcare or agriculture or transport or energy production or water management. So these are sort of the systems that we're designing. So it's really about using the space assets to help in our everyday lives here on Earth.
Wow, like our mobile phone and Wi-Fi, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah.
Wow, that's fantastic. Thank you very much for all this knowledge and all this great stuff you told us. It's really really interesting. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. See you next week.